Now, before we can actually build a float layout, first we need to understand how the float property actually works. So that is going to be the goal of this lecture. So in this section, we will keep working on our blog post page from the Code magazine. And we will use each of the three methods of building layouts to create a layout like this. So at this point, you see that the header here, which has the heading and the navigation, now occupies basically the entire page from left to right. We have the heading and navigation side by side. And then here below, we actually have now these related posts as a sidebar. So we have this content here on the left side and the sidebar on the right side, both below this complete header. And then down here in the end, we have this footer, which again goes from left to right. Now here it has this weird color, but we're going to fix that, of course, later. But what matters is that this is the kind of very simple layout that we will build using float layouts, Flexbox, and CSS Grid. Okay, but for now, in order to get started with this section, I will create new starter files here on my desktop. So since we are building on the previous section, I will simply go ahead and copy this folder and basically duplicate it here. And we'll then rename it to CSS layouts. But once again, just like in the previous section, you actually don't need to do this if you don't want to. So if you want, you can simply keep working in the same files, so in the same project folder that you have been using up until this point. So that's no problem. I'm just doing this so that later in the end, I have it all nicely organized so I can provide you with the final and initial files for each of the sections. Okay, but anyway, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And then here I like to right click to create a new window, then open folder on the desktop. This is the one that I want. Okay, and in the meantime, actually my VS Code has updated, so it now looks a little bit different, but that is of course not important. So what matters here is that our files are exactly as we left them before. So let's open up the relevant ones, close the sidebar, and then let's go back to our live connection. So I click again on Go Live. And so here is that page back. So again, this is exactly how we left it before. And so this is going to be the starting point for now. Okay, so let's go here to the very bottom of our page. So here we are now starting to learn about floats. So I will create like a small section here in our CSS. And in order to actually start learning about floats, let's look here at this piece of our page. So what if we actually wanted these two elements here to appear side by side? So right now they are not side by side because remember that this here is a paragraph element, which is by default a block level element. And so therefore it occupies its own line. So it created a line break before and after its element. Now we could fix that by making this paragraph an inline or an inline block element, but let's now actually explore another way, which is using floats. So let's give each of these two here a class name in our HTML so that we can easily select them. So this one actually already has the ID of author. As I mentioned before, I prefer to always use classes. And so I'm also giving it the class of author and here the class of, let's say, author image. Okay. And let's also add the style or the selector for the author already. Okay, and now let's use the float property And in this case, we are going to set it to left. But here you can see a couple of different options for float, and mainly we can use left, right, or none. So let's use left. And with this, what is going to happen is that this image is basically going to be taken out of the document's flow, just like an absolutely positioned element. Now the difference here with floats is that then all the other elements will basically float around it. So let's give it a save and see what happens. And so here is the result of creating that flow. So as I said, this element here is now basically flowing around this one. And if I added a lot more text, then that would become even more visible. Let's actually do that. So here, let's add some more text. And there is a nice trick in VS Code, which is if you start typing lorem, so L-O-R-M, then you can hit enter. And this will then basically create a bunch of fake text, which we also call blind text. So let's save that. And so now it becomes even more visible how this text now basically floats around this image here, right? So this was just a test. Let's put it back to what it was. And now let's try to add some space here between these elements. So just so we see a little bit better what float actually does. Because now if we set like a padding left to move it, let's say 10 pixels, then nothing actually happened. So let's inspect this. And so you see here in this overlay, let's make it a bit more obvious. So here we can very clearly see that the element itself actually does not start right here where this text is, but it does in fact start right behind the image. And so that's why adding like these 10 pixels of padding, which is actually marked in green if you look closely there on the left, doesn't change a lot. Well, actually it doesn't change anything. So let's put a bit more here, like 50, and still nothing changed because the element is still behind the image. So we would have to add a lot more, let's say like 80 pixels. And only now it is finally enough to start moving out behind that image. So here we could again confirm that this image has been taken completely out of the page's flow. It is as if the image isn't even on the page, right? It does not really affect the surrounding elements. Now let's just, before we continue, add some padding on the top here as well. Let's say 10 pixels. All right. And now let me show you how we can actually fix the fact that this P element basically starts right at the beginning of the container, so behind the image. So what we can do is to float this element as well. So let's also float it on the left. And so now let's check that out again. And now the element starts right after the floated image. All right. So this all looks a bit weird, probably, and it sounds a bit weird, but this is just how floats work. Okay. We could also set it to right here, and then it would move all the way to the right side of the container. So just like this. But once again, we now actually have more modern ways of doing all of this, and in particular Flexbox and CSS Grid. But still, I believe that it's important that you get the basic knowledge about how floats work. Okay, so let's put it back to left. And now here, let's take this out. And let's simply add some margin to the left, because now that is going to be possible again. Okay, and so now this looks nicely laid out. So it's as if this was a very, very small component layout right here. Now, in order to create some space here between this image, so basically this part here and the image, how could we do that? Well, let's try to add some margin bottom to this image just to see what happens. So margin bottom of 20 pixels. And so you see that a floated element is still able to create some margins around it. All right. So actually here we should also use margin and not padding, right? Because what we want is basically space outside of the element. Let's just move this here down. And in order to do that, I actually used a nice shortcut. So that is here in selection, which is this one. So move line up or move line down, which in my case is Alt or Option arrow key down. So this is an extremely handy shortcut that I actually use all the time in order to move some code around. So again, I can just hit Option up or Option down to move it up and down like this. All right. So this is the basic functionality of float, which is kind of weird, but let's make it even weirder and now add some floats to our elements here. So to this H1 and to this navigation here. Now we could do that in the elements that we already selected. So H1 here and then here in the nav, but actually let's select them again because later on I will then want to get rid of this new code when we leave floats behind. Okay, and selecting these elements again and again is of course not a problem. So we can just select them multiple times and then all of the properties will simply be applied. So what I want to do here is have this float to the left side and then the nav to the right side. So the goal is basically to have them both on the same line and have each of them float to one side. Because that will then create an interesting phenomena that I want to explain you. So float right. And let's see what happens. Well, this is not what I was expecting because the nav is not all the way to the right. So let's debug this here a little bit. And oh, well, in this case, it's actually very simple. Here it is not H2, of course. So I was distracted. It is instead nav. Okay. And now it's more on the right side. And if we open up, well, actually, it doesn't change anything for now. But what matters is that this here is now floated to the right side and this one to the left side. Now, the interesting thing that's happening and that I wanted to show you is if you notice this gray background here, and maybe we can make it a bit more obvious. So this header, let's change this here quickly to red. And so now what we can see here is that this element kind of lost its height. So it looks very weird. In fact, the only reason why it is still visible is because we have some padding here. So if we remove the padding, then this element would disappear completely. So at least the background color behind it. So why is this happening? Well, the reason is that all of its child elements, which are in this case only two, right? So the header only has two child elements, the H1 and the nav, and right now all of them are floated. This means that it's as if these elements would not even be on the page. So as if they had been removed. And so now the element basically has no content anymore. And so that way it makes sense that its height is actually 0. So again, the height is now as if it was 0. The only remaining space that is remaining is because of the padding. And if we come down here to the box model, we can see that. So the width is still 720, but the height is indeed 0. And it's only this padding of 20 pixels on both sides that is still making this element visible. But otherwise, the background color would completely disappear. So exactly what happens if we put this here, the first one to 0, right? So This phenomena is what we call the collapsing element, and when this happens, we say that the element's height has collapsed. And again, this did happen because both of its children are now floated. So it's as if they were not on the page anymore. Now, of course, we do not want that, right? So we still want this element here to have the height that it had before. And we can actually fix that, which is exactly what we will do in the next lecture. But for now, just to finish, let's quickly review how floats work and compare them to absolute positioning. Now, floats are actually not a positioning scheme like absolute positioning, but they are still another way in which elements can be out of flow. And so it actually makes sense to compare it with absolute positioning. So we can achieve a floating element by using float left or float right, just as we learned before. And as I was just saying, when an element is floated, it is removed out of the normal flow. And so in this regard, it is exactly the same as with absolute positioning. Now, what's different about floats is that floated elements do still have an impact on surrounding elements. So text and inline elements will actually wrap around the floated element. And so again, in this regard, floated elements are completely different from absolutely positioned elements, which have no impact and are also not impacted by any of the surrounding elements. Finally, one important characteristic of floats is that the container element will simply not adjust its height to the floated element. And so this is exactly the reason why in the last example that we just saw, we saw that that container element collapsed its height. All right, so I hope this quick overview and comparison will make it easier for you to understand floats. And so in the next lecture, as I was saying, we will now fix that problem of collapsing heights. So see you there soon.